We're back now with Matt Leck and David Grisham and Paul Prescod. Paul is a Philly public school teacher. You also have seen his work on Jacobin. At least that's where I'm familiar with him from. And as a union man through and through, and running to represent Pennsylvania's 8th Senate District. Paul, welcome to Left Reckoning.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here.
Really excited to talk to you. And I love I'm very interested in what you're going to bring to state politics. I think it's an interesting conversation we're ready to have. So, But first, before that, talk to us about the district you're running in. Where are we at? Is it urban, suburban, mix of both? Who's working in it?
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything. So the 8th Senate District in Pennsylvania encompasses West Philadelphia, Southwest Philadelphia, a little bit of South Philadelphia, and actually a portion of Delaware County, which is like the surrounding suburbs of Philadelphia. And, this district is very big. I mean, the population is almost 250,000 people who live in it. And it's very diverse in many ways. It's mostly working class Black population. There are significant sections of, East and West African immigrants, Caribbean immigrants. It has kind of this little bit of everything. There's a University of Pennsylvania is in the district, and it has like those surrounding areas. It also has a much more working class part, and then kind of this suburbs feel. But along with that, in Philadelphia, it has some of the deepest, most longstanding poverty in the city, and even lately, and we might talk about this more, but like some of the worst gun violence that we've been seeing in the last few years. So it's a district that I think is really in need of change. The current incumbent who I will be running against is Anthony Hardy Williams, who inherited the seat from his dad, essentially. And he's been there for over 20 years, and he's never faced a primary challenge.
Wow. That sounds like a good recipe to knock off an incumbent, hopefully.
I hope, yeah.
You go ahead, Dave.
No, I mean, I was just hoping, Paul, for people who aren't familiar with you, like, what's your background and what are you sort of bringing that, that district sort of hasn't seen in that office for a while?
Yeah, and I'll go all the way back since Barbados was in the news yesterday. Yeah. I'll say this, my father is actually from Barbados, an island in the Caribbean. And, he's also a public school teacher. So I spent a lot of time on his summer breaks growing up there. And some of my family there were actually very active in the Barbados Labor Party. And in that country, they actually have 2 labor parties, believe it or not. One of them, I would argue, is the fake one, but I won't get into internal Bayesian politics right now. So, I had some family that were active with them. I think that really kind of set the framework for me politically. My first real political campaign was actually my freshman year at a university called Temple in North Philadelphia. And I count myself lucky because that year the Temple Hospital nurses went on strike. And I got involved kind of just like haphazardly in a student support campaign. And it was a very successful strike. It was actually one of very few strikes in the year 2010. This is like coming off the recession. There weren't many strikes happening. It was a very successful strike. And really from that moment on, I was kind of won over to the labor movement. It was a great real life example. This is how you can stand up to corporate power, how you can actually win. So, the rest of my time as a student, I was involved supporting local unions, getting to know that world. And, and then I became a public school teacher and, definitely have seen the effects of the cuts to public education that have been happening in Philadelphia. I mean, there's really no overstating just how, devastating it's become. And, I always say, like, I think if we keep going down this path, we're 15, 20 years away from a totally privatized district. And if you think it can't happen, I mean, look at New Orleans after Katrina. There's not one single public school left. And I think many cities are heading that way, maybe at a slower pace, but I think if nothing is done. And so, I've also been a DSA member, active in the left. And I think specifically just trying to bring the worlds of the left and labor together. That's been a lot of my work. And honestly, that's kind of being reflected in this campaign. And that's kind of coalition that we're going to need to win. So I think, really, I almost lost track of the question, but of why I'm running, what I'm trying to bring. Really at its heart, it's about public investment, like starting to reverse the logic of austerity, reinvigorating the public sector, and I think really naming the enemy. In Pennsylvania, I mean, like so many states in the country, but we have a huge problem with the rich just don't pay taxes. Some of our wealthiest corporations, I'll name Comcast, for example, which, by the way, made a profit of $20 billion in one quarter of 2020 alone. So in Philadelphia, they don't pay property taxes. Pennsylvania is the second largest producer of natural gas in the country. Don't pay taxes. So there's so much room to work with if we were to really go after this revenue to invest in public schools. And I think being kind of a labor candidate, bringing that perspective to this, and I think especially when it comes to climate change and how to develop renewable energy in a pro-labor way, I think someone that's kind of bringing that perspective of how we can actually do that.
Yeah, can you speak to the why the state senate is a good place to go do this? To anybody skeptical of that as a body, because I'm really curious about what we can do there.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, this is my first time running for office, and it's kind of crazy. It's very ironic to me. I've always been someone that's believed, and I still believe, work in the movements is actually the most important thing to do. And I think specifically the labor movement. And I have been convinced, in recent years, I think starting with Bernie, but also others, we can't ignore the state. It needs to be reflected in the state. And I think it's better to have candidates who actually come out of a movement kind of also reflected in electoral politics. And, some people have asked, well, why not try for something like city level first in running? And, my answer is not that I just want to be like a big shot or something, but, I think cities are very limited fiscally in what they can do. And don't get me wrong. I mean, if someone, I'd much rather have a good city council person than a bad one. And there's a lot they can do. But, really the revenue to really do the things, the ambitious things that the left wants to do are at the state and the federal level. So I think state legislatures are actually really important. And also, I'm not an expert in this, but I think I heard this from Harvey Kaye, who is an expert in the New Deal. But, some of the most successful New Deal programs were kind of first piloted at the state level. And I think there's a lot we can do to kind of show in reality that some of these things can work and create a constituency at the state level if we can't do it at the federal level. And so, I think, and I think particularly for some of the issues dear to my heart, like education, for example, in Philadelphia, we really get screwed at the state level. That's where they really keep the funding from us. That's where it's really unequal. And again, if we really were to tap into the revenue sources that are there by taxing the rich, there's a whole lot you can do at the state level. And that includes, some more ambitious like Green New Deal infrastructure programs. Again, if they're not going to be done at the federal level, I think we can start doing them at the state level. And that has a really important political impact, not just from doing them, but I think warming up some maybe unions in the building trades or people that are more skeptical that this thing can work. I think we need to prove to them that it can work by actually getting concrete projects done. And again, I think there's room at the state to do that. States do have a lot of revenue to work with.
I mean, on that, I think one thing that's really critical for left democratic socialist politicians to think about is one, how we're going to be dealing with climate change in a way that works for working people too, right? Because I don't know, there's been a long time on the left where there's this kind of slogan that there is no capital solution to to climate change. And I think the capital solution would be a nightmare, but I can see just mass austerity. I could see them just sort of pulling back a lot of jobs and opportunities for people, sequestering themselves off in areas where they're able. Anyway, I don't need to paint the whole dystopian picture, but we do have to just be prepared that just acting on climate change is not enough. We have to do it in a way that works for working people and doesn't put us in a situation where we're pitting ourselves as working class against one another to defend certain jobs and livelihoods. I mean, what is the kind of path forward in Pennsylvania for trying to build pro-climate policies that also work for labor and working people? Yeah, I mean, I think we're at a really interesting juncture. I mean, both in Pennsylvania and across the country. And I think there's a lot of opportunities here. But, I think something we have to realize, and
often when I've talked to people in the building trades or union leaders, a lot of them say like, yeah, it sounds great, the idea of like, green jobs, but like we need to see that it's real. And we also need to have a real plan for what do we do with the dirty energy jobs. The reality is at the moment, and I don't think this is inevitable forever, but right now, jobs in solar and wind are most of the time non-union and, much lower paying. And it's like, I don't think I could look someone in the face who's making $75,000 a year, $80,000, which is family sustaining. It's not like they're rich, and tell them, well, no, like now you'll make 21 an hour. And so, we just need to have specifics. And a lot of unions are actually in this interesting position, like, for example, electricians and sheet metal workers, where they both work in clean energy and dirty energy. So like sheet metal workers retrofit buildings and to be energy efficient. So there were a massive program to do that. And one of the things I'm proposing is around renovating our public school buildings, which are like literally falling apart. And you could do that in an energy efficient way and create jobs. They would be the ones working on that, but they also work on pipelines. And, I had an interesting conversation with the sheet metal workers president in my area. And he said like, look, I'm all for green energy, but it's just like, what are we going to do for those people that are out of that job? But I do think there's a lot of room. And this is the perspective that a great organization, Climate Jobs in New York, we actually had them on the Jackman show once. They've done a lot of work with labor in New York on green jobs. And what they said was like, look, just start where there is common agreement. Like, let's start on the easier things first to gain trust and show them that this is real. And I think that's the prerequisite to dealing with the harder questions. And I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. I mean, again, we've done some things that a lot of people thought 5 years ago wasn't possible, where we've had panels in Philadelphia with DSA and the local electricians union talking about rebuilding public schools. And I love that issue because like no one has to lose a job from that. Everyone wins. If you expand public transit, one of the unions that endorsed me is a Teamsters union that they build and maintain railway infrastructure, so they would love if we had high-speed rail. So I think kind of starting with those broad areas of agreement and really working to make them a reality, it's kind of like where we start from. And I do think candidates should get more serious about saying, what exactly do we mean by just transition? Like, and this is where I think we do have to be Elizabeth Warren, and we got to have a plan, because many unions actually are cynical even about that term, because they've heard it used even going back to the 90s, 2000s, and it hasn't played out. And I think, and this is something I'm actually working with on my research team, is like, let's come up with some real numbers, and Bernie actually had some pretty good thoughts about this, about saying, at least 5 years they would get paid at their, the level of their previous wage, in the transition. Now, the challenge is, convincing people we can do this, because if we're going to do a real just transition, that's, of course, a lot of money, that we would be dedicating to that. And, so it's always this chicken and egg thing of maybe unions might be skeptical because of the political realities. We don't have the power yet to really tax the rich at that level that we would need to. But I think if just demonstrating more seriousness and thoughtfulness about it will go a long way for labor at kind of starting to convince them.
Can you just talk about your labor support, particularly as a first-time candidate? Just having the best platform isn't enough. And for anybody who's thinking about running for office, like what kind of work do you have to put in, basically?
Yeah, because unfortunately, often labor, they are, they want to play it safe. They want to back the winner. They don't want to damage relationships with certain incumbents. And I think sometimes there's room to criticize that, but I think sometimes there's a very real reason they're doing that. So far we have 4 union endorsements in my campaign, and I'm very hopeful of getting some more soon. I mentioned Teamsters, not just maintenance workers, but also UPS workers. And there's also been a big change in the national Teamsters leadership. The community college at Philadelphia, their faculty union has endorsed as well. And honestly, a lot of this just came from, well before I ran. For years, my activity was in labor before I had any thought of running. And these are really just, and this is like, there's just no shortcut to, these are relationships that were built for so many years, and kind of people knowing that I take labor seriously. And, you know, even some of it was good timing of some new blood in some of local Philly union leadership that, you know, I've kind of taken a risk that maybe others wouldn't. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like I don't have an answer besides, like, you know, really doing that work over the long term. And that is something I'm proud of, if, you know, in our DSA chapter in Philadelphia, is like we have a very close relationship with the labor movement. You know, we're always showing up for them. And after a while, you know, they really take notice of that. You know, even honestly, there's some union leaders who come to Philly DSA meetings who, if you ask them in a separate context, would be like, no, I'm not a socialist. Like, that's craziness. But because they know, like, you know, you all have, whatever you think ideologically, like, you all have supported us on this thing, so I will support you. Yeah, it really is just a long-term fight. But I do think, you know, and this is something I thought about during the push around the PRO Act, which sadly was defeated. But, you know, in DSA, there was a big campaign around it nationally. And it's kind of had me thinking about a really good way to segue from movement politics to electoral politics. I mean, let's just say, you know, a DSA chapter in an area where a Democrat did not support the PRO Act mounted a campaign with labor, that could set up in a few years' time someone out of that DSA chapter primarying that anti-labor Dem and actually having labor support. I think that's kind of like the medium-term thinking we should be doing, of like kind of always having a virtuous cycle of movement activity that can lead to electoral activity, that can reinforce movement activity. I think that's kind of how we should think about our electoral politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's like creating a space where people who want to get things done know, you know, this is the place and the people to speak with, right? Versus like just the folks who have some interesting ideas and, you know, throw a good happy hour party or something like that, right? It's just like,
yeah. And, you know, what they say, I mean, it's very cliche, but like about how much of politics comes down to relationships. I mean, it's true both in, I think, movement organizing and electoral organizing, you know, because again, I mean, unfortunately, it doesn't just come down to like who has the better labor platform. You know, if that were true, you know, we'd have a lot more labor support behind certain candidates.
And just for me, who's like not super familiar with Philly, I mean, there's a huge. I mean, I know like the left movement there is pretty large and involved. I know a lot of folks there, but when it comes to unions compared to other parts of the country, I mean, is there a larger share of labor than, you know? I mean, certainly more than as I would imagine, but you know, they have a labor history,
right? And they're one of the, I mean, unfortunately, shrinking amount of true labor towns. I think Chicago is probably the biggest one we have left. Yeah, but you know, in Philadelphia, labor is still, you know, a decent density, and it's a real force in electoral politics. And that's I mean, besides on principle wanting to have labor on your side, I mean, we even saw this with Joe Biden. I mean, the work that the Union Unite here did, I think, literally won the election for Joe Biden. But you know, they have an infrastructure. Some unions have better ones than others, but like these are also, you know, door knockers, sources of money and power. But yeah, Philadelphia has a sizable labor movement. And again, I think on the more molecular level, for people paying attention, there's been some interesting new blood in certain union leaderships happening where, you know, I think there's kind of this labor left that's been developing Philadelphia for several years. And you kind of start seeing that play out in electoral politics.